not to give praise to the man, but Josh wrote that and he composed that, and it's very beautiful. He's got a really good talent for composition. I can talk a lot, but I can't do all that.
Well, he gave all of us different talents.
Yes, he did. Amen. So, Pastor's not here, as I kind of expected him not to be here just because, well, he's supposed to be out of town, but that is good that we prayed for him earlier. Let's definitely be sure to continue to pray for him because I know it's just, he already has, some health complications, and anything additional is just not helpful. I had a busy last week. I had the opportunity to share with the men at the Good Samaritan, and that was wonderful. The experience was very unique because I'm preaching to people that I've known, most of you, for my entire life. So it's different. It's very familiar. Well, I don't know any of those men there, So it's a very unique experience because you're looking at a completely fresh face. You're looking at a person who has an entire life and experiences that you know nothing about. But you're just sharing your burden for them. And it was a wonderful opportunity, genuinely. There was a song, well, there is a song, I think it's by the Wilds, it's called Press On, which uses the text that I'm using tonight. And if I had a few more months to prepare this, I would have liked to sung it then, but that's neither here nor there. We are going to be in Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2. I was going to do it on Hebrews 12, 1 through 6, but then when I realized how much substance there was just in the first two verses, I decided to just stick to those two. I am up here a little later than I normally am, and that's fine. I'll just have to not go on a tangent, which is going to be a challenge. The book of Hebrews, as we know, it is an epistle to Hebrew Christians. They were in danger of returning to Judaism, and that would have been very enticing to them at the time so that they could avoid persecution. Now, the end of Hebrews chapter 10 discusses some of the persecution that the Hebrew Christians of the day were experiencing. So they were threatened by that persecution and tempted to go back to Judaism. And a lot of this book is basically convincing them not to do that. There's a lot of exhortations to that. The book of Hebrews includes 5 warnings to the Jewish Christians of the day, as well as doctrine that maintains Christ's supremacy over those such as Moses or Aaron, which is important to the Jews of the day because it helped them argue against the doctrine of the Jewish leaders of the day. So the book of Hebrews constantly recalls to the Old Testament. Chapters 3 and 4 of the book of Hebrews draw a comparison. Chapters 3 and 4 of the book of Hebrews actually draw a comparison of the Israelites to the modern day Hebrews. The last 3 chapters of Hebrews, they address practical doctrine for everyday life, and it includes several exhortations for daily living. So we're going to be looking at one of those exhortations this evening, which is the exhortation of perseverance. So we'll go ahead and we'll read our text. And it says, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight, and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God." The word "wherefore" that begins this chapter indicates that this verse is referring to the previous one. Well, the tricky thing about that is that this is the first verse of this chapter. So where does that mean we have to refer to? The last chapter. Hebrews 11 is referred to by many people as the Hall of Faith. It recalls many examples of those who labored in faith, focusing on the belief that God would fulfill his promises. Some of the people who are referenced in Hebrews chapter 11 did not see their promises come to full fruition, such as Abraham. Abraham was told that he would be made a father of many nations. And through faith, he believed that God would fulfill that promise. However, he wasn't alive to see the full fruition of that promise come into effect. But he believed that it would happen. Hebrews 11:13 says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. They pressed on with confidence. We have the luxury of living in an age where many of the promises that were given by God have already been fulfilled. Those in the hall of faith were not made witness, literally, to the fulfillment of God's most important promise, which was the sending of our Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Rather, they had faith that God would fulfill the promise in his own time, which, as we know, of course, he did. And the book of Romans talks about how Abraham was saved by faith. Their example of faith and the fact that their faith in God's promises were fulfilled in Jesus Christ are what this wherefore is referencing in verse 1. When it says, wherefore seeing we also were compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, the cloud of witnesses is a reference to the heroes of the past. They aren't spectators, like they aren't literally watching us, but they are an example for us. The Greek word that is used here for the word witnesses, which is the word martyron, is where we get our word for martyr. It can mean witness or testifier. Their lives bear testimony to God's faithfulness. Warren Wiersbe, concerning this, wrote, when you read the Old Testament, your faith should grow, for the account shows what God did in and through people who dared to trust his promises. The Christian life here is likened to a race, such as a race that was held in an amphitheater, which was common for that time, especially in Rome. The analogy was very common in the New Testament. People such as Paul and Peter included them in their own writings. In Acts 20:24, Luke writes, but none of these things move me, neither count I my life dear unto myself, so that I might finish my course with joy, and the ministry which I have received of the Lord Jesus Christ, to testify the gospel of the grace of God. In Philippians 2:16, Paul writes, holding forth the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain. The author of Hebrews also uses this analogy. And this analogy of this race is given, and the author lists 3 things that are to be done concerning our lives as Christians in this race. Because the race, as we probably picked up on, is the Christian life. First, it says, let us lay aside every weight. So first, of course, we are to lay aside every weight while we run this race. Our lives are ever moving, obviously. Our relationship with Christ is ever changing. There's always growing closer to Christ or farther away from Christ. There's no stagnation in our relationship with Christ in our daily lives as Christians. We are either going towards him or going farther away from him. If you're trying to convince yourself that you can stay in one place for Christ, you're probably moving farther away from him. It doesn't take long living as a person to realize that life is very demanding. There are constantly things that attempt to grasp our attention. It would be ignorant to say that we should neglect our responsibilities, because that's not what this is saying. When it's saying lay aside your weight, it's not saying forget about everything that you have to do. It conveys the idea that we need to lay aside anything that is taking priority over our service to God. Whether that means we completely rid ourselves of it or simply not allowing it to dominate our lives. So most people have a job, but we can't let that take precedence over our relationship with God. Most of us have a hobby that we enjoy. I like to go hiking, but it cannot prevent our growth for Christ. So the question then becomes, what is the weight that is in our own lives? The word translated as weight is actually only found here in the New Testament. It's the word onkos, which is actually spelled O-G-K-O-S, but it's pronounced onkos. A great fun fact for you. It means bulk, so it can refer to a literal weight, but it can also mean encumbrance. An encumbrance is something that is a burden or it is an impediment. For these Jewish Christians, there was something in their lives that was hindering their faithfulness. Likely it may have been the suffering from the persecution that they'd already faced. What's interesting is that this weight is listed separately from the second instruction, which is to lay aside the sin which doth so easily beset us. The encumbrance was a separate issue that needed to be addressed. I would imagine that the encumbrances that we face to our faithfulness in our service to Christ are largely their external things. I'd like to think. similar to how the Jewish Christians of the day, they were facing external issues that threatened their faithfulness, that being their persecution. I'm led to believe that the idea of the weight or the encumbrance itself isn't sinful because it is listed completely separately from the statement and the sin which does so easily beset us. So I would imagine, and I'm led to believe, that the encumbrance itself is not what is sinful. Rather, it is the idea that it possesses the threat to tempt us to abandon our faithfulness. It possesses the threat to dominate our attention more than our relationship with Christ. Like I said earlier, most of us have a job. I have a job, I work. I have the luxury of not having to think about my job when I'm home because I work a physical job. I clock out, I go home, I don't think about it. It's great. I go the next day, I think about work while I'm there, I leave. I don't take any of that home with me. Not everyone has that luxury. It's very easy when you have some kind of blue-collar or physical job to do that because what are you going to think about? It's menial physical labor. But for people who have paperwork and things like that, like Randy has to focus on the end of the month at his job. So that's very dominating of his mind a lot of the time. I'd imagine that he thinks about that outside of work because that's all that the month is looking forward to as far as his job is concerned. But we can't let things like that dominate our mind so much as it gets in the way of our relationship with Christ. That's what the idea is here when it says, let us lay aside every weight. Our responsibilities are important. God doesn't want us to be slothful concerning our responsibilities because He's commanded us to be good stewards of what we have. That being said, they must not become the main priority in our lives. I'm sorry if it looks like I'm reading from my notes directly. I am, because I finished writing them this afternoon. Because I had to write something else on Thursday, and so I'm tired. I'm very happy to be here, and I would do this if I was dog tired because I love doing this. It's a wonderful opportunity, so I don't care how tired I am. As long as it makes sense, and the Lord does what He needs to do, we'll get through this thing. So like I said, the encumbrance itself isn't what's sinful. It's the idea of the threat that it possesses that is sinful. If the encumbrance accomplishes the goal of taking priority in our life, that is when it becomes sinful. For the Jewish Christians, like I said, it would be the persecution. And it talks about it a lot. Later in this chapter, it actually references their persecution a lot more. For us, maybe it's a dominating schedule. Maybe we allot ourselves too much leisure time or something like that. Maybe we're not willing to compromise the time that we allot ourselves to spend with Christ. Maybe. I'm just suggesting things. If our mind is dominated by thoughts that don't pertain to our relationship and our life and our faithfulness for Jesus Christ, that's where the issue begins to take place. There will always be things in our lives that compete to take priority over our faithfulness to Christ. That's just being a human being in a first world country. There's always going to be something that's going to demand your attention. There's always going to be something that's really important that you have to take care of right now. And I hate that. Because we have to be very mindful of what we set our affections on, or what we allow to dominate our thoughts. So, secondly, we are to lay aside the sin which doth so easily beset us. So it says, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us. Interestingly enough, the Greek for this phrase translates literally as the easily entangling sin. And it refers to a single unnamed sin. It's not referencing sin as a concept. It says the sin which doth so easily beset us. And the Greek says the easily entangling sin. So it's referring to something singular. The Greek phrase is also only found here in the New Testament. Apparently, this sin that is besetting the Jewish Christians of the day, or entangling the Jewish Christians of the day, also affected the author, because he says, the sin which doth so easily beset us. So he's including himself in with these Jewish Christians that are suffering. The word beset more accurately meaning, entangle, it reminds me of the parable of the sower and the seed, because, the idea of entangling. So Mark 4:7 says, "And some fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no fruit." So in the context of the parable, it represents those who heard God's message. They showed an initial interest, and they began to grow. But their cares for the world, they allowed things that dominated their thoughts, maybe their own sin, they allowed it to prevent their maturity as a Christian. And I feel as though a lot of Christians today are also trapped in that state. So like I said, sin as a concept, as a total concept, isn't what's being referenced here. Though all sin does get in the way of our relationship with God. I reckon that a good guess for what this unnamed sin is would be their fear. This section of the chapter that follows, verses 1 and 2, it reminds the readers of the day about their persecution. It basically says, even though they suffered persecution, they had not yet had to die for their faith. That's what it says in verse 4. "Ye have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin." Additionally, verses 5 through 13, they teach of the importance and good nature of chastisement when experienced properly. It says, "For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth." So I'm led to believe that this sin which is besetting them is their fear, because they had been persecuted already, and perhaps there was a fear that they would continue to be persecuted. But of course, that's just speculation, because it is unnamed for a reason. While sin in its totality is corrosive to our relationship with Christ, and Paul expressed something about that very vehemently in Romans chapter 7, I believe that most Christians have one sin in particular that has either plagued them the longest, or it has the strongest hold on their lives. So we all sin. Okay, we all sin every single day. Let's not, kind of pretend that we don't do that. We do. But I feel like for most people, and myself included, we all have one sin that's either bothering us the longest, or it's something that we just can't seem to get a hold of. Which is that a fair statement? Okay. For these Jewish Christians of the day, I speculate it was their fear. So then we are left with the question, what is that for me? Okay, so maybe I'll think about that right now. What is that for me? For myself, and forgive me if it sounds harsh, and I feel like for a lot of people, not necessarily anyone here, but I feel like for a lot of people, their relationship with God doesn't grow and it doesn't mature because their sin that they struggle with is selfishness. I know that sounds mean. I think that that's what I struggle with the most personally. I mentioned earlier how, we're very willing to spend our time on things no, I didn't. I think I deleted that when I was writing it. We're very willing to spend our time on things that don't matter a lot of the time. Time is a very precious resource that we have, but we're very willing to spend it on things that are very asinine, things that just don't matter. So we're very willing to spend our time on things that don't matter, but all of a sudden, when it comes to spending our time with God, we're too busy. We don't have enough time in the day. All of a sudden, we don't have enough time because we're not willing to take time away from ourselves. I'll raise my hand and say that that's my biggest obstacle in my race for God. When I get home from work, I'm tired because I don't sleep enough, and that's my fault. So it's my fault that I don't sleep enough, but then when I get home, I don't spend time with God like I should because I'm tired, because I don't sleep enough, because that's my choice. So it's kind of a silly cycle there. That's my problem. I'm very selfish with my time. I think a lot of people are. I mean, it sounds kind of harsh to say selfish. Well, that's not true. I come to church 3 times a week, and I'm in a ministry, and I devote a lot of myself to church. That's great, but when you're outside of church, how much of the time are you spending with God? I don't give God the time that He deserves. It's very easy to treat our time with God like it's not important. It's very easy to, we'll get home or we'll wake up in the morning, we'll read our Bible for like 10 minutes, and we'll be like, all right, good enough. And we'll move on with our day. Our relationship with God isn't medial. It's not something that we check a box and we move on with our day. 1 Corinthians 6:19-20 says, "What? Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Ghost, which is in you, which ye have of God, and ye are not your own? For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's." Our lives are supposed to be a testament to God's glory. They're lives of service. Our lives aren't supposed to be a testament of the things that are here today and gone tomorrow. So we're called for a higher purpose. We, as the Christian body, we are referred to as a royal priesthood. It says that in 1 Peter 2:9. There's so much more for us in this life. There's so much greater use of our lives and of our time. And when we allow ourselves to be made subject to the same sin over and over again, well, we're not only grieving the Holy Spirit, we're not only quite literally hurting God, we're making our service to God more difficult because we're limiting the amount of enablement and blessings that we receive from God. But then we do that and we say, well, God, why is everything so hard? Why are you giving me all these trials? Well, we're kind of bringing it on ourselves. Jesus Christ did not come, and Jesus Christ did not suffer such denigration so that we as people could come and we could sit in a pew a few times a week, and then we could go about our week, and then we could barely be concerned about our purpose being on this earth. Jesus Christ did not die for us to be idle. He died that we might be able to labor for something that's greater, for something that is done out of gratitude. We can't afford to lose focus of what is important. There's a sense of urgency that's listed here when he's saying, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. That's a sense of urgency. Who has ever run a race? Just in any capacity, run any kind of race. How many of you have ran? Literally, with your legs, you ran? Okay. Is this a good illustration? Bear with me. I think this is going to be fine. Is this a good illustration of running? Yes or no? No. Okay. It's not something. I'm not actually going to run. I'll probably fall. Or get out of breath, and that's just as worse. Let's just get out of here. But when we're running our race, we're living our lives for Christ, it's not some idle thing that we just kind of so passively do. It's focused, it's energetic, it's pressing toward the mark of our high calling. That's what it is. We have to cast aside, and that's what the author is saying here, we have to cast aside the sin that's interfering with our growth and service to Christ. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to have anything to show for our lives when we're tried before God Almighty. And then finally, we're told that we have to run the race with patience. So the word that's actually used here for patience is the Greek word hypomenes. And it could be translated more fittingly as endurance or steadfastness, because patience isn't usually a quality that's associated with running a race. The Christian life isn't a sprint to the finish, It's not trying to get there quickly because, the end of the Christian life is death. So we're not trying to get there super quickly. It's a race of endurance. It's a race of steadfastness. Paul spoke of suffering in 2 Corinthians 11 in verses 24-27, and he wrote, "Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice I was beaten with rods. Once I was in the deep. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeyings often, in perils of water, and perils of robbers, and perils by mine own countrymen, and perils by the heathen, and perils in the city, and perils in the wilderness, and perils in the sea, and perils among false brethren, and weariness and painfulness, and watchings often, and hunger and thirst, and fastings often, and cold and nakedness." So Paul endured, and Paul labored until his mission was complete, and until Paul joined his Savior in paradise. We're probably not ever going to have to suffer like Paul did. I think that's a reasonable thing to say, because just the times are different. Now, I'm certain that there are Christians today who do suffer like that. people in countries that aren't so, I wouldn't call our country accepting of Christianity, because I don't think that it is, but other countries are worse. Okay, you know, there are countries right now, like Afghanistan, for instance. I was reading something about how an underground church in Afghanistan had grown tenfold in number since the Taliban took over the country, because they're not accepting of Christianity, obviously, because they worship Islam. They suffer that kind of persecution. You know, when we read about Paul getting stoned and beaten with rods and whipped, that's not something that, you know, doesn't happen anymore. We feel really distant from it because we say, well, that's not going to happen to me. It probably won't. You're right. But that's still happening. And there are still people who are laboring and enduring for Christ, and they're experiencing these kinds of things. So, like I said, Paul experienced this. Those who came before us gave their all. Literally, some of them till their final breath, because they died for the cause of Christ. I think about a lot of the disciples. They were killed. They became martyrs for the cause of Christ. They ran the race with endurance. And even though the Christian life is a race, and even though we have to exercise endurance, you know, we're going to stumble sometimes. You know, even if we are pressing toward the mark, even if our focus is completely on Jesus Christ, we're human beings, and we are going to make mistakes. Rather, we are going to make the wrong choices. That's something that I emphasized the other night at the Good Samaritan, is I told them I don't like the phrase, I made a mistake, because that's just not true. You make a choice. When we sin, that's an active choice that we make. It's not against our good intentions. We choose to do something that we know is wrong. So I don't like to say I made a mistake, because I think that that is voiding yourself of the responsibility of that sin. You sin, that's a choice that you made. So we're going to make the wrong choices in our life. We are going to sin because we're human beings. As terrible as it is, that's just the way that it's going to be. But when we stumble, we get back up and we keep going. Because for a just man falleth 7 times and riseth up again. For us to stumble in our Christian lives and to just stumble and fall and say, well, that's it, I'm done. Christ didn't die for that. The people who came before us didn't do all that they did so that when we experience a hardship, we just say, well, I give up, God, I can't do it. You're giving me your hardest battles and I can't overcome them. We have so much more, there's so much more for us to do than to just do that. That is simply laziness, and that's doing such a disservice to those who came before us. We're not finished in our race for Christ until we stand before Christ, until we stand before God the Father. We're not done with the race. So the author finishes here, he finishes kind of with the analogy of he finishes with the instruction of the race. He says, let us lay aside every weight, let us lay aside the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Great, so he told us how to run the race. And now we're given the objective of our faith, the thing that we're supposed to focus on, Jesus Christ. Just as a runner focuses on the finish line, we are supposed to concentrate on Jesus Christ. He is the objective of our faith. Paul wrote in Philippians 3:14, I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is both a witness, that is referenced in verse 1, because he ran the race, but he is also the one in which our faith is complete. Jesus Christ is in fact the most excellent example of the person who has run the race before us. He was a trailblazer. Jesus Christ laid aside the weight of the persecution that he had to endure. Jesus Christ laid aside the pressure that he had to endure. I mean, I cannot imagine that. Jesus Christ, for all of eternity, before he came to earth, knew what he would have to do. He knew the denigration that he would have to suffer. And that's a lot of pressure, I'd like to imagine. Literally, the entire universe's fate rests upon your life being perfect. That's terrifying. And he knew that, and he still decided to come. And he had to suffer through that, and all of that pressure, and he laid aside that weight. He didn't have to lay aside any sin that beset him because he was Jesus Christ and he didn't sin. But he had to lay aside the weight of that pressure that was there. Because that was constantly, I'd like to imagine, dominating him. I mean, he had to be ministered unto by the angels. He was under so much pressure that he sweat blood. But he had to lay that aside because he had to press toward his own mark. Jesus Christ illustrated endurance and faithfulness his entire life. I mean, for us, at least for myself, living a single day without sinning is hard. Living a single hour without sinning is hard. Well, he did it for at least 30 years. The joy that was set before Christ when it says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him. The joy that was set before Christ was in fact the mission that he was given. It was the mission to author our redemption, and in fact Christ's glorification at God's right hand. When it says, endure the cross, despising the shame, that is a reference to how the humiliation that Christ suffered, as well as all of the suffering that all of us experience, which pales in comparison to Christ's suffering, all of that pales in comparison to the future glory that we will experience. Paul writes in Romans 8:18, "For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." Amen. I don't know about you all, but I plan and I wish to labor till my dying breath. And that's not just a nice thing to say. That is my purpose. I feel called to do that. I feel called to be up here. I wouldn't be up here if I didn't want to do this. You know, when Pastor called me, if I didn't want to do it, I would have said no. But I did. So I said, yes, I would love to do it. And I plan on continuing to do it. I plan on pursuing that as long as the Lord allows me to. But I plan on laboring till my dying breath for the cause of Jesus Christ. And I think all of us should share in that. I would love to be able to lay all that I have and all that I am before him as a testament of my love to him. I think all of us share in that desire. We love God, so we want to express that love to him, or we should want to express that love to him. We have the greatest purpose on the earth as Christians, to strive toward the high mark of our calling to Jesus Christ. Our love for God is supposed to be reflected in our service to God. We are at war with the powers of darkness. I know that sounds very mystical, but it's true. You know, we do not just strive against flesh, but against principalities and powers. I mean, there's a spiritual warfare going on around us constantly. We don't feel like it's real because we can't literally see it, but it is there. It is ever present. We have to fight to accomplish God's will until our death. It's a sense of urgency that is given to it. Until we die, or until the Lord Jesus Christ returns with the sound of a trumpet, with the shout of an archangel as we meet him in the sky. I'd like to end with a quote from the early Christian apologist Tertullian. He says, "You can judge the quality of their faith from the way they behave. Discipline is an index to doctrine." That being said, let us run the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, because that is the most wonderful object of our faith that we can have. And we cannot afford to lose sight of what is important. We cannot afford to let things that are so menial dominate our thoughts when those who come before us gave everything for us to be where we are today. And I think that's it. So I think I'm going to go ahead and ask someone to close in prayer. Brother David, if you could close us in prayer.